At the woman's funeral, her 7-year-old daughter kept shouting, "My mom is still alive." When the father tried to understand why his daughter was saying that, he was so shocked that he immediately called the police. "Why did she have to go, Daddy?" Emily's voice, small and shaky, pierced through the heavy silence in the living room. She clutched a worn teddy bear to her chest, her bright blue eyes wide with confusion and a depth of sorrow far beyond her 7 years. David's throat tightened. How could he explain something he didn't understand himself? His hands trembled as he reached out, pulling her into his lap. "Sweetheart," he began, his voice faltering. Mommy's in heaven now. She's watching over us." Emily frowned, her brows knitting together in that same stubborn way Grace's used to. But why did she go? She didn't even say goodbye. People always say goodbye. David inhaled deeply, struggling to keep the tears at bay. It wasn't the first time she'd asked, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. "I don't know why, Em. Sometimes things happen, and we don't get answers right away. But I promise if I ever understand why, I'll tell you." She nodded slowly, her little hand tightening around his shirt. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the unanswered question hanging between them. Grace Stevens had been the picture of health, or so everyone thought. A 35-year-old woman who jogged every morning, loved her garden, and doted on her family, didn't just collapse and die without warning. But that's exactly what had happened. It was a heart attack, the doctor at the hospital had told David over the phone. The words felt surreal, hollow even. A heart attack? Grace? The same woman who refused to eat anything fried and kept a daily yoga routine. The confusion only deepened after her body was sent for an autopsy. Weeks passed, and still, there were no answers. What baffled David most was the coroner's insistence on keeping the details of her death private. "There are complications," the young coroner had said with a rehearsed professionalism that only made David's skin crawl. "For now, it's best if the casket remains sealed during the funeral." Complications, David had pressed, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "What complications?" "I'm afraid I can't go into detail, Mr. Stevens. Please trust that this decision is in the best interest of everyone involved." That conversation had replayed in David's mind so many times that it had lost meaning. Every time he thought about it, unease bubbled up inside him. How could they bury Grace without even knowing what had truly happened to her? The neighbors had their theories, of course. In a small town like Timberlake, whispers traveled faster than the morning newspaper. "Maybe it was a rare disease," Mrs. Miller from next door had said with a sympathetic shake of her head. "I've heard of cases like that. People look fine one day and gone the next." "Or something they missed during her checkups," Mr. Higgins from the grocery store had chimed in. "Doctors aren't perfect, you know." But there was another, darker undercurrent to the gossip. Not everyone accepted the idea that Grace's death was purely natural. "I don't like to speak ill of the dead," one neighbor had murmured during a gathering at the church. "But you never really know a person, do you? What if she was hiding something?" David had bristled at that, but he didn't have the energy to defend her. The truth was, he didn't know what to believe anymore. Grace's death didn't feel natural. It felt wrong. Emily had started to notice the tension too. "Why are people always whispering when we walk by?" she asked one afternoon, her voice quiet but curious. David didn't know how to answer. "People just don't know how to act when something sad happens," he said finally. "They don't mean any harm. But they don't talk like that about Mr. Harris, and he died last year," she pointed out, her young mind sharp and observant. David sighed. That's different, Em. How? She asked, her gaze unwavering. He didn't have an answer for that either. How? Emily repeated, her small voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Her gaze was steady, too steady for a child her age. It unnerved David in a way he couldn't explain. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll talk about it later, honey," he said softly, almost pleading. Emily didn't argue, but the way she pressed her lips together told him she wasn't satisfied. She turned back to her coloring book, though her crayons remained untouched. The day of the funeral arrived under heavy grey skies. David barely noticed the cold drizzle that dampened his suit as he led Emily into the modest funeral home. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the endless questions swirling in his head. Why the sealed casket? Why the delays? Why did none of it feel real? Inside, the room was somber and quiet, save for the occasional hushed whispers of neighbors and friends. Grace's casket stood at the front, surrounded by a modest arrangement of lilies and white roses. A photograph of her, radiant and full of life, was perched on an easel nearby. Emily lingered by the door, clutching David's hand. She stared at the casket, her small frame stiff and tense. David knelt beside her. "You okay, Em?" She nodded but didn't look at him. "Why is it closed, Daddy?" David hesitated, then gave the answer he'd rehearsed. "The coroner said it had to be, sweetheart. It's better this way." Her gaze shifted to him, full of doubt, but she didn't push further. Instead, she let him guide her to their seats in the front row. As the service began, David felt the weight of every glance directed at him. Some were sympathetic, others curious, but all carried the unspoken question. What really happened to Grace? The minister's voice droned on, a blur of platitudes about loss and eternal peace. David barely heard a word. His eyes kept flicking to the casket, his mind replaying Emily's question from earlier. Why is it closed? It was a question he couldn't answer, not to her, not to himself. Halfway through the service, Emily's voice shattered the solemnity. "She's not in there." The room fell silent, heads turned, eyes wide with shock and confusion. David froze, his breath caught in his throat. Emily stood, her small hands balled into fists at her sides. "Mommy's not in there," she said again, louder this time. "I saw her. She's alive." "Emily, sit down," David hissed, his face flushing with embarrassment. He reached for her arm, but she stepped away, her chin jutting forward defiantly. "She's not gone. I saw her by the woods, by the big tree. She looked at me, Daddy. I know it was her." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. David's heart pounded as he stood, placing his hands on Emily's shoulders to steady her. "Emily, that's enough," he said firmly, though his voice trembled. She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Why won't you believe me? I know what I saw." The rest of the service was a blur. David barely remembered the minister's closing words or the awkward condolences from the guests as they filtered out. All he could focus on was Emily's outburst and the looks it had earned them. After the last of the mourners had gone, David lingered by the casket, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Emily sat a few feet away, her face buried in her teddy bear. I don't know what to say to her. David turned to see Taylor Rowland standing in the doorway, his hands in his coat pockets. He hadn't seen Taylor in years, but his presence was as steadying as it had always been. "You came," David said, his voice heavy with relief. "Of course I did," Taylor replied, stepping closer. I wish it were under different circumstances. David nodded, his gaze falling back to the casket. It's been hard. I can imagine, Taylor said, his voice low. He glanced toward Emily, then back at David. What was that about? What she said during the service? David hesitated. She's been saying things. Ever since Grace passed. That she's seen her. That she's still here. Taylor raised an eyebrow. Do you think she could be right? David let out a hollow laugh. I don't even know what to think anymore. Taylor placed a hand on his shoulder. Let me help, Dave. Whatever's going on, I'll help you figure it out. David looked at him, the weight of the past weeks etched into his face. I don't know where to start. Start with what you do know, Taylor said simply. David nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the casket once more. I just want the truth, Taylor. Whatever it is. Taylor sat at David's kitchen table, the faint smell of stale coffee lingering in the air. He tapped his fingers lightly against the wood, his mind turning over everything David had told him so far. You're telling me you never saw her body? Taylor finally asked, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a tension he couldn't quite shake. David, sitting across from him, looked down at his hands. That's right. The hospital called me at work and said she'd passed. By the time I got there, they'd already moved her to the morgue. Everything after that was handled by the coroner. Taylor leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. And the coroner told you the casket had to stay closed. Did he say why? David shook his head. Just that it was safer. He didn't explain. He let out a bitter laugh, his shoulders slumping. I didn't question it. I was in shock, you know. Grace was supposed to be healthy. I couldn't even think straight. Taylor studied him, the gears in his mind clicking into place. Did you catch the coroner's name? Anderson, David replied. Dr. Anderson. Taylor nodded slowly, filing the name away. All right, I'll start there. If anything about this feels off, and it does, I'll get to the bottom of it. The coroner's office was a sterile, unwelcoming place, its walls painted in a shade of grey that seemed to drain the life out of the room. Taylor approached the receptionist's desk, flashing his badge. I'm looking for Dr. Anderson, he said, keeping his tone polite but firm. The receptionist, a woman in her early 30s with a tired expression, frowned. Dr. Anderson? He hasn't worked here in years. He left. 3, maybe 4 years ago. Taylor's brow furrowed. Are you sure? David Stevens said Anderson handled his wife's case a couple of weeks ago. The woman shook her head. There's no way. Anderson moved to South Dakota after he retired. Dr. Lark is the only one handling cases here now. Taylor's jaw tightened. Can I speak with Dr. Lark? She's out on a call today, the receptionist said apologetically. But I can leave a message for her if you'd like. No, that's all right, Taylor said, forcing a small smile. Thank you for your time. As he walked back to his car, the weight of the new information pressed down on him. If Anderson hadn't been working in the coroner's office, then who had spoken to David? And why had they gone to such lengths to keep the casket closed? That evening, Taylor returned to David's house. The air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth as he stepped onto the porch. Emily was sitting by the window, her teddy bear clutched tightly in her arms. She looked up as Taylor entered, her face lighting up with recognition. Did you find Mommy? She asked, her voice filled with a hopeful innocence that made Taylor's chest ache. Not yet, he said gently, crouching down to meet her gaze. But I'm working on it. Can you help me, Emily? She nodded eagerly, her grip on the teddy bear loosening just a little. Can you tell me again where you saw her? Taylor asked. Emily tilted her head, her eyes thoughtful. By the big tree near the trail. She was wearing a hoodie and sunglasses, but I know it was her. She looked at me and waved. Taylor exchanged a glance with David, who was standing silently by the door frame. Has she said anything else about this? Taylor asked him quietly. David shook his head. She's consistent, though. Every time she talks about it, the details don't change. That's rare for a kid her age, Taylor murmured. He turned back to Emily. Emily, would you mind showing me the tree tomorrow? The one where you saw Mommy? She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Okay, but you have to believe me. Mommy's still here. Taylor had always trusted his instincts. They had carried him through a career full of tough calls, dead ends, and the occasional breakthrough. But as he walked the forest trail Emily had led him to, a nagging unease settled in his chest. Her story had consistency, yes, but it was still the account of a 7-year-old child. And yet, something about the way she'd spoken, the conviction in her voice, made him think twice about dismissing her claims outright. He paused by the tree she had pointed out the day before. The bark was scuffed in places, and faint impressions in the dirt below hinted that someone had been there recently. Taylor crouched, studying the ground. The damp soil wasn't firm enough to hold a perfect footprint, but the indentations told a story. Someone had stood here. A rustling sound to his left snapped him upright. He turned his head sharply, his hand moving to his side out of habit, even though he wasn't carrying his service weapon. The sound came again, softer this time, like someone stepping carefully over a bed of dry leaves. He caught a flicker of movement, just a hint of color, through the dense green of the underbrush. A figure moving away from him. "Hey!" he called out instinctively, his voice low but firm. The figure didn't stop. Instead, it quickened its pace, slipping deeper into the woods. Taylor took off after it, his boots crunching against the forest floor. The person, a woman he thought, was dressed in a dark hoodie, the hood pulled low over her face. She darted through the trees with practiced ease, her movements quick and deliberate. "Stop!" Taylor called again, his tone sharp. But she didn't. She veered suddenly to the right, her path taking her toward the lake. Taylor pushed himself harder, his breath coming in short bursts as he followed. The chase ended abruptly at the edge of the water, where the woman disappeared into a cluster of trees near the shoreline. Taylor slowed his pace, scanning the area for any sign of her. His eyes landed on a cabin, barely visible through the thicket. It was old, the wood weathered and gray, but there was a faint glow of light coming from one of the windows. Taylor moved closer, his steps careful and silent. The air around the cabin was still, save for the gentle lap of the lake against the shore. He crouched low as he approached one of the side windows, peering inside. What he saw made his breath hitch. Grace was there. It took him a moment to recognize her. Her hair, once long and auburn, was now short and dyed black. Her face, though still familiar, looked sharper, more guarded. She was sitting on a worn sofa, her posture tense. She wasn't alone. A man sat across from her, his broad shoulders hunched forward as he leaned on his knees. He was younger than Grace by a few years, with a muscular build and tattoos covering his arms. There was something about him, his restless energy, the way his eyes darted around the room, that put Taylor on edge. The man's voice was sharp, cutting through the stillness like a blade. "You're hesitating, Grace. That's not like you." Grace, or Elsa, as the man had called her earlier, flinched at his tone. Her fingers twisted together, betraying the tension she tried to hide. "I'm not hesitating. I'm being careful. There's a difference." "Careful?" The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sitting in this shack, waiting for someone to catch up with us. That's not careful. That's reckless. You're putting both of us at risk." Grace's voice dropped, quieter but no less firm. "I'm not leaving until I know they're safe. David and Emily didn't ask for this, and I won't let them get hurt because of me." Taylor, crouched outside the window, leaned in closer, straining to hear every word. The pieces were starting to come together, though the picture they formed was still far from complete. Grace wasn't just running from something. She was running to protect her family from it. The man stood abruptly, pacing the small space with restless energy. "You think staying here is going to change anything? They're better off without you, Grace. They'll move on." Grace's head snapped up, her eyes blazing. "You don't know them like I do. Emily is 7. She doesn't understand why I'm gone. David." Her voice cracked and she paused, taking a shaky breath. "David loved me, even when I didn't deserve it. He doesn't deserve this now." Taylor felt his stomach twist. Whatever Grace had done, whatever had brought her to this cabin in the middle of nowhere, it was clear she believed she was doing it for her family. But what had she done that was so unforgivable? The man stopped pacing, turning to face her with a hard expression. "This guilt trip of yours is going to get us both caught. You've been holding on to this perfect little fantasy of a family for too long, and it's clouding your judgment. You think the people chasing us care about your husband or your kid. They'll use them to get to you. And you're making it easy for them by staying here." Grace stood, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Don't talk about them like that. They're not just some family. They're my family. And if you think I'm going to abandon them, you don't know me as well as you think you do." The man rolled his eyes, muttering something under his breath. He moved to the door, his hand resting on the handle. "You've got until tomorrow to make up your mind. Either you're with me, or you're on your own." Taylor waited until the man left, disappearing into the woods, before slipping away from the cabin. His mind raced as he made his way back to the trail. Grace's words lingered, a strange mix of regret and determination that he couldn't quite reconcile with the woman David had described. When he reached his car, he pulled out his phone and dialed the local police station. "This is Detective Taylor Rowland," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I need a team to meet me near the old lake cabin off Route 17. We've got a situation that needs immediate attention. I'll explain when you get here." The dispatcher acknowledged his request, and Taylor hung up, his thoughts already moving to the next step. He scrolled through his contacts until he found David's number. It rang twice before the familiar voice answered. "Taylor?" David sounded wary, as if he already sensed something was wrong. "It's me," Taylor said. "Listen, I need you to do something for me. Keep Emily at home. Don't take her out, and don't let her out of your sight." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What's going on?" Taylor hesitated. He didn't want to alarm David more than necessary, but he couldn't afford to downplay the situation. "I can't explain everything right now, but Grace, she's alive, David. I saw her." The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. When David finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Taylor said. "But there's more to this than I thought. She's not alone, and whoever she's with, he's dangerous. Just stay put and keep Emily safe. I'll handle the rest." Taylor. David's voice wavered. Do you think she's in trouble? Taylor exhaled slowly. I think trouble is following her, and it's closer than we realized. The cabin door creaked open just as the first officer reached the perimeter, a sliver of light spilling out into the darkness. Taylor held up a hand, signaling the team to hold their positions. He edged closer, his footsteps deliberate, silent, and his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. Then the figure emerged. Grace, her hood drawn low over her face. She paused for a moment, glancing around the clearing as though sensing she wasn't alone. Behind her, the man stepped into view, his broad shoulders stiff with tension. Taylor's voice cut through the night, firm and commanding. Grace, stop right there. Grace froze, her head snapping toward the sound. The man beside her reacted instantly, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the woods. Go, now, he barked. Taylor lunged forward. Don't do this, he called, but it was too late. They were running. The forest was alive with motion as the team sprang into action. Flashlights bobbed like fireflies in the darkness, cutting through the dense undergrowth. Taylor sprinted down the trail, his eyes fixed on the faint outlines of Grace and her companion, disappearing deeper into the woods. Branches clawed at his arms, and the uneven ground threatened to trip him with every step. But he pushed forward. The voices of his team crackled through his radio, but he barely heard them over the sound of his own ragged breathing. They're heading toward the lake, he shouted into his mic. Cut them off if you can. Ahead of him, Grace stumbled, her foot catching on a root. She fell to her knees, but the man yanked her up with a force that made Taylor wince. She protested, her voice carrying through the trees. Let me go. You're hurting me. Quiet, the man hissed, dragging her along. Taylor pushed himself harder, the distance between them narrowing. Stop running, he yelled, his voice hoarse. You're not going to get away. The chase ended abruptly at the lake's edge. Grace and the man skidded to a halt, their path blocked by the dark, rippling water. Taylor slowed his approach, his flashlight illuminating their figures as they turned to face him. The man's eyes were wild, his chest heaving. He reached into his jacket, but Taylor's sharp command froze him in place. Don't, Taylor warned, his tone low and dangerous. His hand hovered over his holster. Whatever you're thinking, don't do it. Grace stepped forward, placing herself between Taylor and the man. Her hood fell back, and for the first time, Taylor saw her face clearly. She looked older, worn by fear and guilt, but there was a spark of defiance in her eyes. Taylor, please, she said, her voice trembling. Don't do this. Let us go. Taylor shook his head. I can't do that, Grace. You know I can't. She swallowed hard, tears glistening in her eyes. I never meant for any of this to happen. I wanted to protect them. By running, Taylor countered. By hiding out in the woods with someone who's clearly dangerous. He gestured toward the man, whose hand still hovered near his jacket. Grace looked over her shoulder, then back at Taylor. He's my brother. He's the only one I have left. Taylor blinked, the revelation momentarily stunning him. Your brother? Yes, Grace said, her voice firm despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. He's made mistakes, terrible ones, but he's family, just like David and Emily. I couldn't abandon him, Taylor. I couldn't. The officers arrived moments later, their flashlights casting long shadows across the clearing. Grace's brother raised his hands reluctantly, his jaw set in a grim line as he surrendered. Grace hesitated, her eyes darting between Taylor and the approaching officers. You're making a mistake, she whispered. "No, Grace," Taylor said softly. "The mistake was thinking you could outrun this." One of the officers moved to cuff her, but Grace didn't resist. As they secured her hands behind her back, a folded piece of paper slipped from her jacket pocket, landing on the ground near Taylor's feet. He picked it up, his brow furrowing as he unfolded it. It was a photograph, worn and creased from being carried for so long. David, Emily, and Grace smiled back at him from the image, a snapshot of happier times. Taylor stared at it for a moment, then looked up at Grace. "You still care about them?" he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Grace's lips trembled. "Of course I do. Everything I've done. It's been for them." Taylor nodded, tucking the photograph into his pocket. "Then help me make this right, Grace, for their sake." Back at the station, Taylor watched from the observation room as Grace and her brother sat in separate interrogation cells. David's voice over the phone still echoed in his mind, full of disbelief and hurt. "She's alive," David had said. "But why did she leave? Why didn't she tell me?" Taylor didn't have an answer for him. Not yet. But as he looked at Grace through the one-way glass, he knew the truth was closer now than ever. The interrogation room was silent, the kind of silence that pressed down on you, thick and suffocating. Grace, or Elsa, as Taylor now knew her, sat across from him, her hands folded neatly on the metal table. Her posture was calm, but her eyes betrayed her, flickering with unease every time Taylor's gaze locked onto hers. "You've got a lot to explain," Taylor said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, measured, but carried an edge that warned there would be no room for lies. Grace exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I suppose I do," she said quietly. "Let's start with the basics," Taylor continued. "Who are you really? And why did you fake your death?" She hesitated, her fingers twitching against the cool surface of the table. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had run out of places to hide. "My name is Elsa Forrester," she began. "I was born in Spain. For most of my life, I wasn't a good person." Her voice cracked, but she pushed on. "I got involved in things I shouldn't have. Smuggling, fraud, and worse. I thought I was untouchable, but Interpol didn't agree." Taylor leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "Go on." "They were closing in on me. There was no way out, except to disappear completely. So I left Europe. I changed my name, my appearance, everything. I became Grace Stevens, a completely different person." She paused, swallowing hard. "And for a while, it worked. I met David. We got married. I had Emily." Her voice softened when she said her daughter's name, a glimmer of genuine emotion cutting through the heavy air. "I thought I could leave it all behind," she continued. "I thought I could be someone else. And I was, for a while. But the past doesn't just go away. It follows you. It finds you, no matter how far you run." Taylor tapped his pen lightly against the table, his mind piecing together the fragments of her story. "Your brother," he said. "He's been with you through all of this." Elsa nodded, her jaw tightening. "He got involved because of me. I dragged him into my mess. When Interpol came looking, he was the one who helped me fake my death. We planned everything. The jog through the woods, the heart attack, the closed casket." Taylor's stomach churned at the thought of David and Emily grieving over an empty coffin. "Did you ever think about what that would do to them?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I thought about it every day," Elsa said, her voice trembling. "But the alternative was worse. If I stayed, they would have been dragged into my mess. David would have been questioned. Emily. She trailed off, her face crumpling. I couldn't let them go through that. And yet, you stayed close enough for Emily to see you, Taylor pressed. Elsa's lips twitched into a faint, sad smile. I couldn't stay away completely. She's my daughter, Taylor. I had to know she was okay, that David was okay. Hours later, Taylor stood outside the interrogation room, watching through the one-way glass as Elsa sat with her head in her hands. She looked small, fragile, as if the weight of her confessions had finally broken her. Across the hall, her brother was less forthcoming. He sat with his arms crossed, his expression defiant as he refused to answer any of the officer's questions. Taylor didn't need his cooperation to know the truth, though. The man's tattoos and scars told their own story. A life filled with violence and crime, one that mirrored Elsa's past. David arrived at the station late that night, his face pale and drawn. He'd left Emily with a trusted neighbor, though Taylor could see the hesitation still lingering in his eyes. She's here, Taylor said simply, leading David to the observation room. Through the glass, David saw her, his wife, the woman he'd mourned for months. For a long moment he said nothing, his expression shifting from shock to anger to something Taylor couldn't quite place. She doesn't even look like herself, David murmured. She's been running for a long time, Taylor replied. People change when they're running. David shook his head, his hands clenched into fists. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she trust me? I think she thought she was protecting you, Taylor said. Whether she was right or not, that's for you to decide. Later, Taylor returned to Elsa's cell, finding her sitting on the narrow cot with a pen and paper in her lap. What's that? He asked, nodding toward the paper. A letter, she said, not looking up. For Emily. She deserves to know why I did what I did, even if she never forgives me. Taylor watched her for a moment before speaking. Do you really think she'll understand? I don't know, Elsa admitted, tears slipping down her cheeks. But I have to try. She's my daughter, Taylor. She's the only good thing I've ever done. Taylor nodded, stepping back toward the door. I'll make sure she gets it. As he left, he couldn't help but wonder if Emily would ever be able to see past the lies to the love that had driven them. The story of David, Emily, and Elsa is a haunting yet deeply human journey of love, deception, and redemption. It portrays the lengths people will go to protect their loved ones, even when their choices cause pain and heartbreak. Elsa's transformation from a fugitive with a dark past to a mother grappling with the consequences of her actions is profoundly moving. Her struggle to shield her family while confronting her guilt paints her as a flawed but relatable figure. David's resilience and unwavering love for his daughter offer a counterpoint to Elsa's turmoil. Despite the betrayal, he prioritizes Emily's emotional well-being, showing that healing comes not from erasing the past, but from facing it with courage and compassion. Taylor, too, embodies steadfast loyalty, serving as a pillar of support and a reminder that integrity and empathy can guide even the most difficult decisions. The story leaves a powerful message. Our pasts may shape us, but they do not have to define us. Redemption is possible when we confront our mistakes and embrace love, even in its most imperfect forms. It's a poignant reminder that family bonds, though tested, can endure and ultimately provide a path to healing. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.